live as one in perfect harmony. Requires common sensibility to teach and intellectual capacity that I believe is in the air, but everywhere is the ultimate act of treason. So few could be aware that their nation's heart is bleeding. Oh, when the violence has begun, we decree the pen more mighty than the gun, while the fools believe is one in this unrepentant age of unreason. Just to think that not so long ago was a man who received the seal. He peddled blatant lies and brought back tyranny to divide his people with zeal. But we can live as one in perfect harmony. It requires common sensibility to teach and intellectual capacity that I believe is in the air, but everywhere is the ultimate act of treason. So few could be aware that their nation's heart is bleeding. But oh, as a child who prays for fun, with his eye up to the barrel of a gun, watching fools believe is one in this unrepentant age of unreason. Now the darkness has begun. We decree the pen more mighty than the gun. Watching fools believe is one in this unrepentant age of unreason.
We are live.
So welcome everyone. It is a pleasure and an honor to be here for the last session of the International Conference of the National Institute for Science and Technology in Digital Democracy in Brazil. We are happy to be in the last session. We had over the week, we had 39 articles presented, 7 international sessions with participants from 4 continents and 11 countries, 188 participants discussing digital democracy from several angles, several perspectives. So it's been a great journey, and there wouldn't be a better way to finish this journey than having Lincoln Dahlberg and Hans Asenbaum to discuss contemporary configurations of the public sphere. So we'll start this final session with a brief introduction of our guests, and then we'll proceed with the presentations. So Professor Lincoln Dahlberg is currently working as an independent scholar. He has previously worked as a researcher and lecturer at Massey University, New Zealand, the University of Queensland, Australia, and the Victoria University of Wellington. His work focuses on the critical analysis of digital communication systems with respect to radical democratic imaginaries. Lincoln is one of the editors of Discourse Theory and Critical Media Politics from Palgrave, published by Palgrave in 2011, and Radical Democracy and the Internet, published also by Palgrave in 2007. He has published several very influential articles in journals such as Yavanos, Communication Theory, New Media and Society, Theory and Society, Information Communication and Society, and the Journal of Computer-Mediated Communication. And I must say he's probably one of the main early voices who draw the attention of many of us to several dimensions of online communication from a critical perspective. So it is really an honor to have Lincoln here with us tonight. And Hans Asenbaum is a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the University of Canberra, and a visiting fellow at King's College London. He holds a PhD from the University of Westminster in the UK. Hans is a co-convener of the Participatory and Deliberative Democracy Specialist Group of the Political Studies Association. His research interests include identity and inclusion in new participatory spaces, digital politics, and feminist and gender theory. Hans' work has been published in the American Political Science Review, New Media and Society, Communication Theory, Politics and Gender, and Political Studies. The Brazilian Institute for Digital Democracy has hosted a talk delivered by Hans a few years ago when he presented his work on anonymity. I have also had the chance to collaborate with him in many occasions now, and I feel honored to have had the opportunity to learn so much from this brilliant scholar. So without further ado, we'll move to Lincoln's presentation, then to Hans, and then we'll have our time for Q&A. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. It's wonderful to be here, and I want to thank Ricardo for organizing this session and for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be part of your conference, and as I was saying to Ricardo earlier, it's just wonderful to have an exchange between us monolingual Anglo-Saxons and Latin Americans, multilingual Latin Americans. So I do apologize for our monolingualism, but hopefully I can contribute something to your conference in the few minutes I have available. What I want to do is outline some of my current research that I'm doing with the aim of highlighting my current research theoretical concepts and methodology, so as to bring attention to some of the issues in digital democracy theory and research that I see as important, particularly in my area. My research for over 2 decades has focused on the internet's relation to democracy, taking a critical theoretical approach, which means for me taking a problem-driven approach, one that identifies socio-political problems and associated questions before deciding upon specific methods and empirical cases, all of which is framed within critical theory's always present meta question of how can things be made better? This meta question in turn entails seeing present conditions and practices as socio-political, that is, as able to be otherwise. The identification of problems and the questioning of how things can be made better also presupposes normative claims and commitments that need to be made explicit. As such, one of my main concerns has been to theorize a normative conception of the public sphere adequate for my internet democracy research, and hopefully for others' research, believing that such conception has ongoing critical purchase with respect to evaluating the internet democracy relationship. Indeed, the relevance and importance of conceptualizing a democratically demanding public sphere conception for today has become starkly highlighted by the terrible fact that at the same time as we are faced with a range of global existential crises, from COVID to inequality to climate warming and other environmental crises, we are also faced with a global crisis in democratic communication, led by the digital media practices of a range of despotic leaders within nominally democratic nations, which Brazilians have experienced all too much of. I have developed what I refer to as a radical public sphere conception from an articulation of Habermasian and Laclauian theory. This radical conception follows critical theory's embrace of strong norms of democratic communication. This is in contrast to positive approaches that reduce the public sphere, including deliberation, to a value-free description of practices, meaning that the public sphere conception is vulnerable to being weakened or even discarded by any particular empirical observations that do not fit it, a move that has been increasingly made by digital communication scholars, arguing that the public sphere has been outmoded by contemporary digital practices. But my radical conceptualization of the public sphere does not simply dogmatically embrace public sphere norms, but also embraces critical theory's immanent rather than idealist understanding of norms, and extends this immanent status to deeming norms following Laclauian discourse theory to be radically contingent, and thus open to rearticulation at any time, and openness which is in the essence of democracy, and which I have utilized in my incorporation to the public sphere conceptualization of Chantal Mouffe and other critical theorists' emphasis on agonism and affect, as well as my incorporation of other concepts such as visibility. that help the public sphere conception better to speak to today's digital media practices without diminishing the democratic demands and normative force of the conception. I will talk more about some of the specific normative criteria of my radical conceptualization a bit later on, but I now want to turn to the substantive problem of my critical theory research into the internet-democracy relationship. The question that first sparked my interest in digital democracy, and the question that keeps coming back to me, and that frames my current research, even after over 2 decades about thinking about digital democracy, follows upon Habermas's colonization thesis in asking, how does corporate ownership and control negatively impact the internet's capacity to enhance the public sphere, and how can this impact be mitigated? This question is probably why it's probably important, as it followed upon the time when I started this research in the mid-1990s, just after the internet was commercialized. And the question is, what would happen when the internet was commercialized to the democratic practices that were taking place on the internet? Following this question, I have deployed critical political economy and critical technology studies alongside normative critique, drawing on qualitative approaches where required. Now, negative impacts of corporate ownership and control on the internet's capacity, democratic capacity, have been identified as far back as when the internet was commercialized in the mid-1990s, as I just suggested. But they have not, until recently, been of much concern to most technology commentators or politicians, or to many researchers, particularly in deliberative democracy, in mainstream deliberative democracy. This lack of general concern has been true for digital social media, the democratic potential of which was from the mid-2010s extensively celebrated. In fact, it was seen as to be radically democratic. Social media was seen as radically democratic compared to previous internet communications, which in the mid-2010s, early internet communications were deemed, particularly web, what's called Web 1.0, was constructed as undemocratic, so as to construct social media and what was called then Web 2.0 as strongly democratic. But the negative impact on this potential and of social media was ever the democratic potential of social media is ever increasing corporate colonization. The negative impact of this corporate colonization was largely ignored. This ignoring prompted me to focus my research specifically on digital social media rather than on the internet in general. Facebook, the most dominant of these corporate colonizers, has worked hard over many years to ensure that the negative impacts of this colonization continue to be ignored, carefully cultivating an image of itself as supporting and supportive of democratic and quality public sphere communication through identifying itself with openness, inclusion and diversity, connecting, informing, civic engagement, free expression, giving voice, making the marginalized visible and heard, and thereby empowering the powerless. Facebook's founder and CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, has recently referred to the Facebook platform, as a global town square, a public space, and a fifth estate. He contrasts this and also Instagram with the WhatsApp platform, which I know is used a lot in Brazilian politics, but he positions WhatsApp as a private space. And for this reason, WhatsApp could be even more dangerous than the main Facebook platform. But I'll leave this at this point to Brazilian researchers who will know more about this to go into analysis and inform us all about the dangers of WhatsApp, positioned as a private platform but used as a political public platform. But of course, the 2016 presidential election took place, and this was followed by a whole range of scandals around Facebook's role, both in those elections, but it's in other elections and other events, from Russian interference to Macedonian teenagers plying Facebook with sensationalist and highly partisan clickbait news. And the scandals continued afterwards, after the election, from the Cambridge Analytica affair to Facebook's implication in Myanmar hate speech and ethnic cleansing, to the special exemptions that Facebook gave to Trump's disinformation, to Facebook's role in Brexit, as well as a range of other right-wing populist election victories around the world, including, of course, those in Brazil. Suddenly, Facebook's positive relation to democracy in the public sphere was put into question by journalists, academics, politicians, and others. And Facebook was forced to mount a major public relations campaign so as to manage the ongoing public scandals about the quality of the communications on its platform, and to resell the idea that it had a positive relationship with democracy. As a result, my research turned to focus not only on how corporate ownership and control of social media platforms impacts their democratic potential, but on how these platforms are managing the increasing visibility and concern about this impact. In other words, I added discourse and ideology critique to my normative critical political economy and critical technology analysis, which has prompted me to think about how these types of critique can articulate and how this articulation might alter these critical approaches. For this analysis, I have taken the Facebook platforms, the Facebook platform as my main case, not only given its market dominance, but given its centrality to concerns about social media's impact on democracy. And within this case, I am focusing upon the ideological performance of a stream of quality, of what I'm calling quality initiatives that Facebook has announced over the last 3 years. Given that these initiatives are at the heart of Facebook's ongoing public relations campaign, with new or revised initiatives and progress reports being constantly rolled out, promising to ensure that Facebook becomes the home of high-quality public sphere communication. Facebook's new quality initiatives can be summarized under labels remove, reduce, inform, and promote, following the categories that Facebook itself uses in its public relations. The initiatives announced as already implemented promise, firstly, to remove hate speech from propaganda, fake accounts, and bad advertising. Secondly, to reduce the visibility of clickbait and disinformation. Thirdly, to inform users of the identity of those paying for political advertising, as well as of the trustworthiness of publishers, of any fact-checker warnings, and of how they can use Facebook to better control and judge what they see and how they are seen. And fourthly, the initiatives promise to promote meaningful interaction between friends and family, as well as promoting personally informative, trustworthy, shareable, and local news. So that's just a summary. There's many more details, and there's multiple initiatives that are constantly rolled out by Facebook, normally in reaction to the latest scandal or the latest negative publicity about it. So its main reaction is to say, okay, we're going to do this, or we're going to do this, and they keep repeating these. But they are some of the main main categories of initiatives that they're working with and announcing. Aside from their ideological work, which I will come back to in a few moments, the initiatives have actually that have actually been implemented by Facebook have had some practical success with respect to tackling Facebook's quality problems, including success in reducing financially driven clickbait, removing foreign political advertising and disinformation campaigns, or some foreign political advertising and disinformation campaigns, I should say, and expelling some explicitly bad actors and associated content. But many researchers, critics, and commentators argue that Facebook is still amplifying low-quality public sphere communication, as we'd all know from our own practices. From a critical political economy perspective, the low quality of public sphere-oriented communication will largely remain because the political economy logics shaping the communications and maintaining the low quality are successfully enabling Facebook's profit and growth interests, and thus will be protected from inequality initiatives, and indeed will frame any such initiatives. To be more specific, while making some improvements to the quality, the initiatives do not and will not alter the negative relationship or antagonism that exists between Facebook's profit-driven, targeted advertising and thus engagement-maximizing business model and quality public sphere communication. An antagonism which critical political economy commentators have pointed to for some time that can be predicted from Habermas's public sphere theory, with a norm of autonomy of communication from commercial interests is necessary for advancing other public sphere normative criteria, a necessity that has been overlooked in liberal accounts of the public sphere and democracy, such accounts tending to conveniently forget Habermas's colonization thesis. In other words, I'm arguing here that the norm of autonomy from both corporate as well as state interests has often been dropped from liberal accounts of the public sphere and liberal analysis of digital democracy. I'll take a moment to tease out these claims that Facebook's political economy driving low quality public sphere communication and about the related fundamental antagonism between Facebook's business model and quality public sphere communication before coming back to my ideology critique in a few moments. The basic argument is that Facebook's targeted advertising and engagement maximizing business model, where engagement is defined as individual communicative actions that maximize data and user profiling, leads to a stimulus response model of communication, which in turn leads to overall poor quality public sphere communication. Indeed, the stimulus response model of communication leads to the amplification through Facebook's algorithms and other visibility control mechanisms of outrageous, scary, creepy, sensational, conspiracy peddling stories that many of Facebook's critics point to as a reason that Facebook needs to be regulated and forced to be responsible as a content publisher and not just as a technology company. But Facebook's public sphere quality problem is not to do with, I would argue, how far out or emotionally affecting the claims made in these stories may be. Rather, a critical theory understanding of the public sphere, from a critical theory understanding of the public sphere, the problem is in the form or structure of communication. And this links back to what Stephen Coleman was talking about in his presentation, or linked somewhat to what he was talking about in terms of the form of communication. That is, the problem is that the stimulus response model amplifies types of communicative action that are on the whole low in quality in contrast to public sphere constituting communicative action, which is not very efficient in stimulating reaction and generating data. Here I understand public sphere constituting communicative action to ideally involve the meeting of difference in which private and entrenched positions are challenged by contrasting claims on shared problems, where the challenge takes place by way of respectful, reasoned, and critically reflexive, if passionate, interrogation. These elements of deliberative contestation engagement are, along with communicative autonomy and communicative equality, the central normative criteria that I see as constitutive of any democratically strong public sphere. Such deliberative engagement impedes reactive engagement, the type of engagement that Facebook's algorithms are promoting, and thus does not rate well in Facebook's visibility determining algorithms, As such, the outrageous, sensational, conspiracy peddling and emotive stories that are amplified the most by Facebook are those that are subject to the least, if any, deliberative contestation. Thus, what is needed to improve the quality of public sphere related communication being spread by Facebook is not the top-down sanitizing of communication, which Facebook is being pressured from many quarters now into performing from all sides of politics, in fact, in the United States, are now wanting Facebook to in some way sanitize its platform. And that risks, and this sanitizing risks shutting down already marginalized voices, as well as keeping users as individualized and privatized. So the idea of censorship from top will be that Facebook is in charge of determining, or other leaks determining what people discuss, what topics and issues they discuss. So it actually continues to keep individuals as individuals within their own mindsets without engaging those individuals in these discussions of what should and shouldn't be talked about. So what is needed is not this top-down sanitizing, but rather what is needed is more deliberative contestation that will constitute critical publics able to democratically interrogate any communications. Take, for example, conspiracy stories and conspiracy theories, which, for instance, the left is very concerned about. For instance, the whole QAnon, which is quite a mad conspiracy theory. But just put aside its madness for now. Conspiracy theories should not be deranked or even eliminated unless constructed only as reaction-seeking, which is in fact what Facebook wants and constructs its algorithms around. If they are not just simply reaction-seeking, conspiracy stories should be seriously interrogated and deliberated upon, as there are many real-world and real conspiracy theories, particularly produced and undertaken by states and corporations. So what happens with a lot of these conspiracy theories that are actually on Facebook is they are actually obscuring real conspiracies that are taking place in the world. So conspiracies should be interrogated because conspiracies do exist. They just don't happen to be conspiracies as crazy as are pushed forward by Facebook's algorithms of the likes of QAnon. So what the last thing we need is something like what happens in China with its state-driven, and platform-driven censorship of online discourse. To advance this deliberative contestation, not only will Facebook's visibility control mechanisms need to be significantly recalibrated around deliberative rather than reactive engagement, but Facebook's platform as a whole will need to be rewritten, as it is currently designed in terms of stimulus-response model communication, with reaction-shaping mechanisms deployed throughout its platform, epitomized by the aptly named reaction buttons, that from the start mitigate against public sphere constituting deliberative action, promoting instead privatized, dogmatic, and strategic communication. Moreover, advertising in general, and not just political advertising, which everyone focuses upon, needs to be identified as a significant problem for quality public sphere communication, at least where it encourages reactive responses and puts forward individualized and instrumentalized solutions to shared problems, thereby privatizing what should be public sphere concerns. Finally, in terms of the problems that Facebook's business model poses for quality public sphere communication, by making engaging and communication most visible, by making engaging communication most visible, the system introduces structural inequalities into its communication, whereby voices that stimulate reactive engagement are more visible than those that don't, adding to the inequalities of voice resulting from visibility being offered for sale in the form of advertising, which is often overlooked. Those who can pay the most on Facebook get the most voice. And that is a real issue for the public sphere, a real structural issue for the online public sphere. This is in contrast to the equal access to visibility expected by any democratically demanding public sphere conception, and again, sometimes forgotten in digital democracy research. The overall poor quality of Facebook's public sphere related communication will largely remain, as I said earlier, because as long as profit maximizing is Facebook's goal, the business model logics driving it will be protected from inequality initiatives. In other words, the platform will not be rewritten in radically democratic terms, no matter what Zuckerberg says. And yet I want to argue that the quality initiatives do in fact address the negative relation or antagonism between Facebook's business model and quality public sphere communications, doing so not by changing the political economy logics, but by working ideologically. Hence, we return to the discourse analysis and ideology critique of Facebook's quality initiatives. And just 2 or 3 minutes to finish off discussing this work of ideology. The initiatives work ideologically in combination with Facebook's general public relations by articulating or discursively constructing, through the claims that they make about the quality problems and about what they do to address the quality problems, a non-antagonistic, where not positive, relation between Facebook's system and quality public sphere communications. I'll say that again. So initiatives work ideologically by constructing a non-antagonistic relation between Facebook's public sphere system and quality public sphere communications. They eliminate the antagonism in this relation. They do so by obscuring the negative impact of Facebook's public sphere, Facebook's political economy on public sphere communications. By ideological work, I mean the decontestation, depoliticization, and naturalization of a social relation or discourse in the interests of particular groups. In the Facebook public sphere relation, Facebook's owners' interest in profit and growth maximization is defended by the decontestation of the Facebook public sphere relation and its naturalization. Decontestation that defends against critiques pointing to the antagonism within this relation, critiques that threaten to lead to growth and profit undermining political action. So in other words, Facebook constructs a relationship between itself and the public sphere that is non-problematic, that there is nothing to contest, that there's no antagonism within that relation, there is no contradiction within that relationship. And it does that through these initiatives. And in my research, I go into much more detail about how that happens, but I don't have time to go into that ideological construction of this non-antagonist relationship here. So that will have to be left for another time. But I'll just simply very quickly summarize 2 aspects of how the initiatives undertake this discursive construction of non-antagonism in the relationship between Facebook and the public sphere. They help to construct this non-antagonistic relationship in 2 ways. First, they construct a very distorted and narrow definition of quality public sphere communication. In the articulation of the initiatives and what the initiatives are going to do and what the problems are, they define what the public sphere is in a very narrow way. They define what democracy is in a very narrow way, in such a way that it actually aligns with the communications on Facebook. So that actually Facebook makes out that the communications on Facebook are public sphere communication, because what is excluded is a whole of elements of democracy in the public sphere that Facebook does not produce. So it constructs this very narrow idea of what democracy is, and then says, oh, look, our communications actually do produce democratic communications, leaving out a lot of aspects of what a strongly democratic public sphere would consist of. Secondly, the discursive articulation of Facebook, the initiatives discursively articulate Facebook as a good democratic actor whose interests are in driving quality public sphere communication. They do this by promoting this whole series of quality initiatives and showing, look, we are really good actors. We're solving all the problems. You can trust us because we're going to take on all the quality problems around democratic communication. Secondly, they name and blame a whole lot of bad actors external to Facebook as the cause of the problems. Facebook's not the cause of the problems. It's the Russians or a whole lot of other people that are the problems, And so identify these others as the problems, bad developers, Cambridge Analytica, not us. It's not us doing this. These other people, we're the good actors. And thirdly, by positioning Facebook as aligned to and enabling various good democratic actors. So it aligns itself with academic researchers, brings them into its research and articulates itself with academic researchers, scientists. The whole COVID thing has been very good for Facebook with it, for aligning itself with science and with health. Aligning itself with civil society actors and human rights groups, news media organizations, fact checkers, and increasingly with democratic governments around performing itself as helping to write regulations around the internet. This ideological work by the initiatives to construct a non-antagonistic relation between Facebook and quality public sphere communication is a central part of Facebook's ongoing general public relations response to critiques of the quality of its quality in relationship to the public sphere. Through this PR campaign, as well as significant political lobbying, Facebook is working to frame the discourse around the quality problems and their possible solutions, not only technical, but also policy and regulatory solutions. To conclude, I simply want to state that the critical theory-informed analysis that I have briefly outlined here suggests that for advancing the democratic public sphere, it is necessary to pay attention to a number of things. And I just want to highlight the things, the main issues that I think that need more attention paid to. And these are norms and developing a strong normative and maintaining a strong conception of the public sphere, which includes the interest that I know many of you have in conceptualizing what deliberation consists of. But also I would emphasize that the idea of autonomy and equality of communication needs to be thought about more. To think about communicative form as essential to what the public sphere consists of and what public sphere norms should be. We need to pay more attention to ideology, and we need to pay more attention to political economy, including corporate colonization, not just state colonization of the internet. And subsequently, it is necessary to continue to explore ways in which to democratize social media infrastructures, because advancing the public sphere today requires such democratization, which means the construction of spaces of communicative action autonomous from corporate as well as state power. Thank you.
Thank you, Lincoln, for the great presentation. And we'll move straight to Hans, and then we'll come back for questions. Okay, so thank you, Hans. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ricardo. Well, thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here. It's really important, as Lincoln said, that we have an exchange, between, also globally, between countries in very, very different places. I've been to Brazil, as Ricardo mentioned earlier, in 2017, actually. And I've visited the center and the institute, and it was a real pleasure. And I met many great people there. So I'm really happy that I can be here with you today, at least virtually. And I hope I will be able to travel again in the future, and we will meet personally. Okay, so let's start the presentation. I will be talking on the question, what is digital space? And I will draw on insights from participatory democracy to answer this question. I think intuitively we talk a lot about cyberspace as something spatial, but I want to figure out whether it actually is something spatial. Is there anything actual spatial about cyberspace? And how can we make sense of the physical, the material things, and the digital things, and how they relate to each other? So I'd like to start with a quote from Judith Butler, who works on social movements online and offline. And she says, and if this conjuncture of street and media constitutes a very contemporary version of the public sphere, then bodies on the line have to be thought of as both there and here, now and then, transported and stationary. And I think she nicely points to this unresolved problem here of how can we make sense of being online while actually being physically offline, and how does the online and the offline, the digital and the analog relate to each other? And that's what I'm attempting to make sense of in discussing digital space here. So just as an overview, I'm going to proceed in 3 steps. First, I will present 3 theses and briefly discuss 3 theses on digital space. So the theses that are out there in the literature, and as you can probably guess, I will disagree with all of them and then propose my own thesis. So I will argue that we need a new understanding of digital space, and to produce this understanding, I will draw on insights from participatory democracy and a conception of participatory spaces offline, actually, to understand and make sense of online participatory spaces, or engagement online more generally in digital space. And this will be the 3rd step, which is a new understanding of digital space. So, digital space, is it just a metaphor? There's a lot of metaphoric talk around space when we communicate online, right? So there's cyberspace, obviously. There are chat rooms, there are forums and home pages. We can see how the terminology of space can be found in all of these words. There are echo chambers, firewalls, paywalls, the electronic frontier. We travel on the information superhighway. We go online, implying walking here. We surf on the internet and go on a safari. We're space cowboys and cybernauts. So we can see that it's not just the term of cyberspace or digital space itself, but rather there's a whole complicated or intricate terminology around cyberspace that all implies movement in space, or it very directly addresses cyberspace in some spatial configuration itself, right? So all these words point towards an understanding of digital engagement as something spatial. So I'd like to address 3 theses that are discussed in the literature that explain digital space, and this is the first part of the presentation. The first one is radical and says cyberspace is actually not a space, right? It's not a space at all. Think about it. If we talk on the phone, if we write letters, all of this is not spatial. So why should, writing an email be something different, or communicating on Facebook? Why is that something spatial? Well, I will argue against this thesis, because I think that this spatial terminology that I've just highlighted on the previous slide is not there coincidentally, right? We perceive being online as a spatial experience, so there must be something spatial about cyberspace, right? And this will be my main argument throughout the thesis, that cyberspace or digital space is indeed a space. The second thesis says cyberspace and analog space are separate spheres. And this obviously goes back to the discussions in the 1990s that envisioned cyberspace as something completely divorced from real space, as cyber democrats back then said. So here's a quote: "Cyberspace is another life world, a parallel universe, offering the intoxicating prospect of actually fulfilling a dream thousands of years old, the dream of transcending the physical world, fully alive at will, to dwell in some beyond, to be empowered or enlightened there, alone or with others, and to return." So the idea here is that cyberspace is something completely divorced, something completely separate from analog space. And obviously, those were theories in the 1990s when the internet also worked a bit differently, or online engagement worked a bit differently. So this is obviously outdated. And we perceive online engagement, at least it is theorized today, much more as something that blurs the boundaries between the online and the offline. There is no clear separation, and that is exactly what the third thesis argues. It says cyberspace and analog space are the same thing. They are one kind of space. And I think there's actually quite a lot of merit to this thesis when you think about how the topography, the physical topography of the world has changed, and how it is now infused with technology that mediates the internet, right? So it's the smart devices in our pockets that we carry with us, but it's also the smart refrigerators, the smart TVs that we have at home. It is cloud computing, it is Wi-Fi connectivity, it's the smart screens that we use everywhere we go, in the supermarket and so on. So we can see that space is really technologically reconfigured and mediates the internet basically everywhere we go. And beyond this, we can actually see that we now perceive the world through technology. So we don't actually look at, in parentheses, the real world directly anymore, but we rather look at it through our smart devices, and that changes our perceptions. And this image here is also symbolic for how these smart devices enter our socialization. They co-construct us, they enter into who we are, because obviously we are socialized with them. So then this convergent thesis goes further to say we actually perceive the world through these smart devices. So I think there's a lot of merit to the convergence thesis. However, but we perceive the distinction between analog and digital as real. So it is real, right? There is a distinction. I think this convergence thesis tends to go too far and speak of, well, we don't need to differentiate between these two spheres because they're one sphere. Well, I think we do need to differentiate between them because we intuitively know that they are two different things. So we need to make sense of how they relate to each other rather than understanding them as one thing. So I'm going an alternative way here. I'm proposing an alternative approach, which goes back or draws on theories that are actually quite old, from the 1980s, cyborgian theories of Donna Haraway, obviously, who said that cyborgs are constituted by machine and human parts, organic and digital, but the two do not completely converge. They don't form one thing that cannot be differentiated within, but rather these two different spheres, these two different parts, they assemble, they relate to each other, but they stay distinct, because she said there is an unresolved tension between the organic and the inorganic that remains. We can never resolve this tension. I also draw on the notion of evocative objects by Sherry Turkle, a psychologist who said that these smart devices, or at her time when she wrote in the 1980s, these computers, they enter into our socialization, they affect us, and they are not mere tools, but rather they have agency over us. So they become partly subjects. They are evocative objects, not just objects, but objects that call on us in certain ways. And lastly, I draw on assemblage theory, which is more recent development in theory, here in Jane Bennett's work, but other people as well, who basically says that anything can be explained as an assemblage of some parts. So there are always things that relate to each other, and these things affect each other. So there's nothing neutral, there's nothing inanimate, but everything has a certain power over the other parts. And I think this is a very fruitful perspective on understanding the relationship between online and offline space and understanding what cyberspace or digital space actually is. So I think at this point we can narrow down the question. If we look from the perspective of assemblage theory, we can ask not just what is digital space, but more precisely we can ask, how does digital space assemble? And how is digital space different from analog space? So these questions I would like to address with the help of insights from participatory democracy and participatory spaces offline, going into the second part of the presentation here. So I think that participatory spaces offline, and here I'm simply referring to any kind of participatory political process. So we can think about social movement gatherings, we can think about referendums, political campaigns. We can also think about democratic innovations such as participatory budgets, which are or were very popular in Brazil, or citizens' assemblies. So any participatory democratic process can be thought of as a participatory space. It can be thought of as in spatial terms. And I think this is so fruitful to connect this to the study of online engagement and of digital space, because they have a lot in common. Offline participatory processes, well, obviously they are participatory, and online engagement is per se interactive. It requires some form of participation. So there are some overlaps here that I think are very fruitful if we look at these offline participatory processes to conceptualize online spatiality. So I define democratic space or participatory spaces as a relational construct that enables and limits action. And here we can see again the parallels with online engagements and websites and the communicative infrastructure of the internet, which also very clearly how websites, how interfaces are constructed, enables, so affords and limits what can be done and what cannot be done, basically. So to further get an understanding of these participatory processes in spatial terms, I differentiate between three different dimensions of participatory spaces. The material dimension is the obvious one. So if we want to define space, we define it usually in material terms as the relationality between physical things. But then I argue that beyond that, there is also a sentient dimension of space, of participatory space, in the human bodies that come together, that debate with each other, that have emotive relationships with each other. And thirdly, then, there is a discursive dimension. So it also counts what people say in these spaces, and their articulations also inherently follow a discourse, a spatial nature. The grammar of what they articulate is in itself a spatial construct. So I argue that participatory spaces are defined by these three dimensions, and these three dimensions come together through the human act of synthesis. So that's basically the cognitive act that we all constantly do to make sense of what's going on. And in participatory processes, we perceive material things, we perceive sentient human bodies and discursive constructs, and all of these together assemble as a participatory space. I'm going to go through these dimensions very quickly with a couple of examples. So if we look at the material dimension, we can, for example, look at how parliaments are set up and how the physical spatial configurations of this parliament influence a certain kind of engagement. So different settings of chairs and benches also influence the culture of the respective parliamentary debates. If we look at citizens' assemblies, we can see again that the physical outline of these tables that put everybody at an equal position also creates a certain kind of engagement. And lastly, we can look at social movements, how the purposefully constructed openings in a city as a public square afford participation. Here, very clear, again, the analogy, the parallel with online participation, where again, an infrastructure affords certain kinds of engagement. Now that's the physical dimension, which is rather apparent about space. But then there's also a sentient dimension. And here I think the work of Hannah Arendt is really helpful, who says the space of appearance comes into being wherever men are together in the manner of speech and action. So actually here is an idea of a space that exists because human bodies come together and because of the emotive relations with each other and because of their interactions between each other. So it doesn't need physicality, it doesn't need materiality to constitute a space. Rather, it needs the human bodies. And we can see that, for example, in the Great Council in the UK, which predates the UK Parliament, where the advisors of the king or the queen came together, and it didn't matter in which physical space they assembled, rather it mattered who they were and how they related to each other. So here we see a mobile idea of space. And lastly, the discursive dimension of space. We can realize this discursive dimension if we focus on the fact that any kind of articulation that we engage in, whether it's spoken or written, always follows a spatial structure. Our grammar, to a certain extent, predetermines a spatiality of our articulations. If we try to visualize what we're saying or thinking, we end up with spatial configurations such as this mind map, or if we engage in discourse analysis, again, we try to visualize this, again, we can see that we have spatial results in front of our eyes. So to sum this up very briefly, and I know there's quite a lot of content I'm throwing at you here, but to just make it very clear what I'm saying, participatory spaces offline are constituted by a physical surrounding, by the material relations between material things, but then they're also constituted by the people who assemble, the human bodies who assemble within this space and their articulations. And it's the interplay of these three things that together create participatory spaces. Now at this point, we can return to our more specific questions. How does digital space assemble, and how is it different from analog space? Well, I think an answer is that digital space is constituted by the same spatial dimensions that I just outlined. So we don't need to reinvent it. And that's also pointing or showing that it is actually a space online, because it is constituted by the same three dimensions. However, they assemble in a different manner. They assemble differently. And this is what I'm going to get to in just a moment. So communication devices are now entering our spatial assemblages, the offline, the analog assemblages, and they're at the same time interrupting these assemblages and mediating these assemblages. So what I'm trying to say here is that usually, if we wouldn't have these communication devices, we would meet face to face, we would meet in person, and that would constitute the space. But now we're interrupted because we're located in different spaces. The space now appears as something, the physical space appears as something decentered, but at the same time, these communication devices also mediate communication. They make communication possible that would not have been possible otherwise, or we would have to meet face to face. So let's, in the third part, very briefly, I'm going to try to sketch a new understanding of digital space by drawing on these three dimensions and trying to show how digital space assembles differently from offline space, but it is constituted by the same dimensions and hence is a space. So let's look at the material dimension online. Obviously, there is the material infrastructure of the internet, and theorists today are eager to point to this material infrastructure, the data centers, the wires and cables that span around the world, and the satellites that make internet communication possible. And indeed, this is an important factor. But if we think about the material of dimension of online digital space, then I think another kind of space is important. We need to think of the physical locations where participants in an online interaction are located. So we can think that some people might be located at home, others are in bed, others again are in a restaurant, others might be at work in an office, others in a park, and others yet again at the gym. So we often don't account for how these different physical surroundings affect the respective person. We all online, we all talk together, but we're separated, and we're actually, so in a way, communication is interrupted here because we're located in different physical spaces that are only brought together by the social and discursive dimension. So physical space is decentered while discursive and sentient space is connected. Let's look at the sentient dimension here. Obviously here social media plays a key role. It puts people into connection. It creates new and recreates old relations between people. There's a new selfie culture where we can present ourselves online equivalently or differently to our offline identities. There are emojis through which we can express our emotions, and many other things could be mentioned here. What I'm trying to point at here, that there is a rich and a thick social communication. There are sentient exchanges between people happening online, and that's why it is a space, because this sentient spatiality is one of these three dimensions that constitute space. If we look at the discursive dimension, again, many differences with offline communication can be noted. A lot of the communication, obviously not all, but a lot is written. In offline, obviously, we talk and don't write mostly. We can share our communication with certain audiences and might reach unintended audiences. Our communications are searchable. There is the hyperlinked nature of the internet. So a lot of special things. But what is important, again, is that communication is happening. And communication, verbal communication, the discursive dimension of space, is a defining characteristicum of space. And it connects the people who are physically located in different places. So I'm ready to conclude this presentation, coming back to this main question, what is digital space? And coming back to the three theses that I presented early in the presentation. Cyberspace is not a space. Well, my argument is it is a space. It is a special kind of space that integrates decentered physical spaces through the material infrastructure of the internet, through the sentient and the discursive communications between people. The second hypothesis, cyberspace and analog space are separate spheres. Well, very obviously, nowadays at least, they are not. And thirdly, cyberspace and analog space are the same thing. Well, I think this is going too far. I think the two do not converge, but I think assemblage theory gives us a really nice tool to understand how they relate to each other. So what is important to observe is that they assemble the same things, they assemble the same dimensions, however, they assemble them in a different manner. So to just conclude and drive my point home here with images as well, digital space is usually understood as something like this. It is something that happens on a screen. It's an immersive experience where we enter another world, and it happens on websites, it happens on a screen. But my image that I'm proposing is a very different one. An important point about digital space is that we're located in different physical spaces. So when we talk about cyberspace or digital space, we should immediately reflect on these physical spaces where people are located, that they are in different conditions and under different exposure of different environments that affect how we feel, who we are in that very moment. Okay, I would like to conclude on this note. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Hans. I think we had two great presentations and great topics for debate. I'm not going to be long here because we don't have much time, and I'd like to have as much time for Q&A as possible. But just taking a few points on what was said. So Lincoln Dahlberg presented this broad normative view of the digital space, and invoking the need to take a closer look to Facebook. And I specifically like the end of the presentation when you summarize the need to pay attention to conceptualizing deliberation, autonomy and equality, communicative forms, ideology, political communication, and not just state colonization. So you bring from the Habermasian discussion, and the need to democratize social media. I think that's a nice set of elements to drive the agenda in different directions in order to keep central the normative critical perspective in analyzing these phenomena. But I have one question, and I think it's a simple one, but just to make clear on your specific point. How do we move forward in order to promote a more democratized democratized social arenas? What's your take on regulation, for instance? Because you seemed a bit skeptical about the possibility of state regulation, and I wonder what's your main point on how to move forward in order to promote this democratization of social media. And Hans, nice presentation as well, very insightful presentation on the multidimensional approach of space in order to reconceive of the way we look at the whole idea of cyberspace, and presenting these three dimensions: the material dimension, the sentient dimension, and the discursive dimension, and the different syntheses that are possible between these dimensions. And your main argument is that the difference between digital space and, if I understand you correctly, an analog space is the way that these same dimensions are assembled. But then I come to the question, doesn't the multidimensional approach challenge the need to distinguish analog and digital spaces? That's where you started from. Can't we understand that analog spaces are a part of this broader assemblage of digital spaces, and also that digital spaces become an element of the way that we experience analog spaces? So I like the way you started dividing them, saying against most of the literature, and saying they are experienced as different, so we should conceive of them differently. But I wonder if the multidimensional approach doesn't point to a different way to look at these that doesn't need a very sharp differentiation. But so that's all I'm going to say for now. And I'm going to, if that's okay for you, I think it would be good to collect some questions, and then you can react to whatever you consider appropriate. And I'm sure that there will be better questions asked from the audience now. So João will help us here, and he will bring some questions from the chat. So Lincoln Dahlberg, thank you for your talk. It was great. We do agree about how technological and corporative structures play an important role in how these platforms might shape social interactions. But what about the other way around? Does it make sense to think that some kind of social agents surpassed this structural power and shaped it? So this question is asked by Professor Camilo Aggio from Federal University of Minas Gerais. Second question is from Rodrigo Carreiro from the Federal University of Bahia. Congratulations, Hans, great presentation. What this conception of digital space help us to understand the current forms of participation or political discussion in social media? So how does... Can we collect two more, João, in order to... so that they have a few questions to... Okay, then we have a question from Nardine Almar, who presented yesterday, and from the University of Canberra. To Lincoln, you argued that we should look at political economy. What kind of political economy do you have with Facebook in the public sphere. Sadowski, you said rentier capitalism for digital platforms. Do we have one more question, João, or should we just move for answers now?
Answering, and the question will keep going.
Okay, thank you, João. So these 3 initial questions for you. So can we start with Lincoln again?
Okay. Thank you. I'll start with your very good question, Ricardo, because actually the I went over time and I'd already cut out half my presentation, and your question is in the other half of the presentation, which is here. So I could spend 10 minutes reading out my answer to your question, which I just deleted from the end. And I thought, well, maybe I could be invited back another time if I was if I was wanted. So yeah, a lot of regulations are being proposed at the moment all over the place. And in fact, I'm finding it very hard. I started this 5 years ago looking at Facebook, and I was just doing a very quick paper, and it's taken me, and it keeps going because everything keeps changing the whole time. And it's sort of horrible to be able to actually publish anything, because I've just got, mountains of written pieces now that keep having to change. And one thing has been the regulation idea, and how Zuckerberg has come in and is embracing regulation, realizing that now that actually he can't beat regulation, so he's going to try and mold it to what Facebook wants. In fact, Facebook's in a very big advantage because they are dominant, and so if they bring in regulation, it'll probably lock out competitors anyway, including democratic competitors and alternatives. So this will be a way to entrench Facebook, and under COVID, this will entrench Facebook even more as a necessary platform for society. So now Facebook's in the position to mold regulation, not only through the types of ideology I was talking about, but also through very big lobbying. In the last 5 years, they spent a lot of money on lobbyists in the US Congress to control what's going on behind the scenes, despite all the talk that's been going on. But look at the European Union. European Union has brought in a lot of regulations. The problem about the regulations they've brought in, it's a lot been around the private sphere and around regulating competition. And I think this is possibly the wrong way to go. And it's sort of a neoliberal answer, is like focusing on competition. And if we can get competition right, we can get the market to operate properly, then everything will be good. But I don't think that's the answer for democracy. It might be an answer for a neoliberal market and for privacy. And I know privacy is important for the public sphere too, but a lot of their laws don't actually touch on the public sphere. So whether it be copyright law, content censorship, privacy rules, competition rules, that's what Europe's been focusing on. The United States, all the talk's been around regulating the platforms, not regulation, but more breaking up the platforms, because the United States tradition has more been around creating competition by having small firms. It's been monopolies. Let's not have rules, but let's not have monopolies is the problem. And so that's where recently a lot of the discussions have been taking place. Now, I'm not against the regulation. I think we've got to be careful what the regulation is, that we don't entrench Facebook and actually support it. For instance, the GDPR and other laws, privacy laws and so forth, content censorship laws. Facebook and Google, those two companies in particular, can put in massive AI systems. So they've spent hundreds of millions of dollars to develop AI systems to abide by those regulations, whereas smaller companies and civil society organizations cannot do that. They do not have the money to do that. So this is very dangerous for actually locking in those companies. So we've got to think very carefully about what we do here. Ideally, for my position, ideally would be to say that Facebook should be socialized. Now, that's not going to happen at the moment under the United States law or culture, but that's what should happen. Ideally, is that these companies should be like the BBC. They shouldn't be state-owned, and they shouldn't be they should be public-owned. And of course, that's a dangerous road to go down too. given the history of what's happened with state ownership. But the BBC would be a model to follow, but that possibly can't happen. So my suggestion very quickly would be that we need to look at a combination of regulations. Some libertarians would argue no regulation, but I don't agree with that. I think at this stage regulations are needed, but we've got to be careful. And the regulations I would suggest would be first of all, funding non-commercial, democratically oriented platforms with some sort of rentier tax, talking about one of the other questions about rentier tax. And yes, I think these are rentier corporations, and rentier blue economy, I think, is useful, just to point to one of the questions. And but again, putting some of these regulations into practice might be difficult, but certainly taxation needs to be looked at to fund these monopoly platforms in the way that they're actually taking a lot of the money from other public entities, particularly the mass media organizations. We need to enforce strong public data portability and platform interoperability regulations, so that we can take Facebook data and Facebook friends from Facebook. But not only this, but the data that they own should not be their data. It should actually, and it shouldn't be private data either, which a lot of people are proposing this idea that it's our data, we should be able to own it and sell it. It's not. It's actually publicly produced. Talking about public space, it's publicly produced data, so it should be publicly owned, and private organizations should rent that back to use it and be approved by public deliberation whether they actually can use that data or not. And I think that's very important, that we should go down that road, not the private data road where it's like individual private data. I think critical education is very important compared to the sort of education policies that are going on at the moment in this country, and I'm sure other places, where we've got to construct every individual as a computational subject. No, I think our citizens our students should be constructed as citizens who can critique what's going on, not just be placed into the marketplace as little computers, which is actually at the moment the model that's been promoted. And finally, I think the US idea of breaking up the monopolies is probably a good line of thinking, but not for competition purposes and not for market purposes as much as to reduce their power to control policy. At the moment, Google, Facebook, Amazon have too much power over states and over democracies, so their power needs to be reduced. Monopolies, I think, as such, are not necessarily bad if they're democratically controlled monopolies, but these are not. So in some cases, monopolies, like monopoly over the transportation of power or other resources, over education, if it's democratically controlled, then single systems can be useful. Centralization can be useful if it's democratically controlled centralization. But at the moment, what we're getting is centralization that is privately controlled and non-democratic centralization. So that was a long answer, sorry, but I did have another 10 or 15 minutes on that. So probably don't have much time for the other two questions. I might get back to those two in a minute, but I want to give Hans a chance to answer first his questions.
All right, sure. Yeah, thanks, Ricardo. It's a really good question. I mean, I think we do have to differentiate between online and offline, and the digital and the analog, but we need to think about how they relate to each other. So I think that the current debate of like completely converging is going too far. And what I was trying to sketch out, though, is that since the two kinds of space are inherently, well, space, so they have a lot in common. They need the same analytical tools. So they need the same analytical categories. I think what a lot of people are doing who are differentiating between online and offline, they look at the digital versus the material. And for me, in my definition of space, the digital doesn't play a role, right? It's not one of the three dimensions, it's not a fourth dimension or anything, right? So the digital can be analyzed through the same lenses, with the same tools. And that's, I think, how I'm trying to make sense of it. But I'm happy to talk about this more at another occasion as well, to develop further ideas here. And then the question regarding what can we learn about political participation, maybe activism online, by applying this understanding of digital space that I proposed. I think what we can learn is that we can pay more attention through this lens to the physical locations where people are located when they engage with each other. So we think about an online protest, for example. We think about what's happening on the screen, but we should also think about the actual person sitting at home or sitting in the park or sitting in the gym or wherever she or he might be, and how these surroundings affect the person, and how like the emotions that might come up in an offline protest that we then share with all the people around us cannot be shared at this moment because probably the person is alone. So there are also these interesting dynamics here that I've discussed earlier as a form of cyborg activism, right? I wrote a piece on that, on cyborg activism, looking at Anonymous and thinking about how these people who are in their private homes contributing and protesting publicly. So it's an interesting reconfiguration of public and private here happening. And I think by paying more attention to these private spaces, we can learn a lot about activism, online protest, and participation on the internet.
Okay, so I think we could have a second round of questions and then bring it back to each of you, and then Lincoln can comment on those other points as well, and then we wrap up. So João, do you have, I saw that there are lots of questions on YouTube. Did you select a few? Okay, so there's a question by Nina Santos, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Federal University of Bahia as well, at the Institute. So Hans, thank you very much for your presentation. It's pretty clear to me that the digital space should be considered as a space, but shouldn't we think that associated with the notion of temporality? So how do you bring time into your equation, Hans? Second question by Professor Vitor Chagas from the Fluminense Federal University in Rio de Janeiro. So great lecture, Hans. I really like the 3 distinct space model, but I was wondering if there is still a 4th category which connects these different spaces through time. So another person asking on time. And so a space of memories, which is not limited to emotions, discourse, or material space, but assembles them and creates representations. I would like to hear some reflection from you about it. Thank you. Do we have a third and last question, João? So Camilo Ajo, so all the questions for Hans at this round. I'm sorry, but that's good because we can comment on those 2 other questions. Hans, thank you for your talk. It was great. We are facing some huge challenge in the democratic world. Some call it, some call this the democracy crisis, and relates it to some supposed digital platform contingencies. We have been witnessing the rise of many right-wing extremist groups in the core of this problem. It poses a question about political participation as a democratic virtue. They do participate a lot on digital media as they couldn't in other times. So how do we deal with digital participation that can erode democracy? So thank you. So I think we should start with Hans and then move back to Lincoln. Okay.
Well, thank you. Really insightful questions. I'm not sure that I have insightful answers. I thought the question about time is so interesting, and I got exactly the same question in another talk that I gave on just offline spaces, on these participatory spaces. Somebody also asked, isn't there a 4th dimension of time? I'm really struggling with this. I'm so, grateful if you can send me any advice. I'm not sure how to incorporate time into this model, because I feel like time is something outside these 3 dimensions. The dimension of time is something in a way separate, but obviously there are also conceptions of space-time as the same thing. So that's something I would just need to read up on more and get into more. But I'm also grateful for any ideas and tips. And then lastly, the crisis of democracy and right-wing protest online. It's a good question whether to understand this as political participation, to which I think obviously the answer is yes, it is a form of political participation, but is it a form of democratic participation? And here's where it's getting tricky. And there's also something Lincoln referred to earlier. What do we do with these conspiracy theories, right? Are they a legitimate part of the discourse, or should we, should Facebook, for example, have these policies to completely cleanse their platform? And wouldn't that also suppress marginalized voices? So it's really hard to draw a line here between the democratic and the undemocratic. And how do we deal with these undemocratic elements? Do we, as Democrats, try to suppress them, or should we aim to suppress them, or should we aim to sanction them, or should we hear them? Because this is obviously also a democratic value of inclusion. How can we include these people? I mean, these are a lot of open questions that I don't have great answers to. I'm more in favor of hearing and including, because I think that will dissolve tensions rather than suppressing them and then have them bubble up at another occasion. But that's my personal take. Yeah, so that's what I've got so far. Thank you.
Thank you, Hans. And back to Lincoln.
Thank you. Yeah, just some general points when Hans is talking about it. I agree. I think the internet provides a great forum for structuring communications, so that in hearing voices, we don't have to just put up with aggression, but we can hear the content, the claim, without being then ourselves being silenced. So that's what I'm talking about, is allowing voices to be heard. Because if we start censoring, if Facebook starts censoring anything that is deemed by dominant discourses to be illegitimate, then a lot of claims from both the left and the right will be eliminated. I mean, we'll end up in a Chinese situation where we just simply end up with Facebook's supporting whoever's in power. So you go down as a slippery slope down that line. But I think Facebook provides, or not, Facebook should, but internet provides the opportunity for structuring communication. And I think that's what we're all, and maybe a lot of us were interested in the first place, and how that can be done. And Facebook has sort of undermined that, and these private spaces have undermined that by bringing a different form of communication to the fore, which is driven by the profit motive. And I think on the term of space, that's really interesting. The idea of space goes back a long way in terms of derivative thinking, because, of course, Habermas was critiqued for the fact that a lot of his work was based on these spaces that were face-to-face spaces, although it was forgotten that he also talked about mass media, the public sphere being constituted through the mass media communication. And I think it's important to think about, because a lot of the work, when the public sphere has been written off in relationship to internet communication, there's been claims that the space is completely different, so we can't compare it to, say, cafe discussions or whatever. And I've disagreed with that. And I think your work, Hans, is very important there in conceptualizing how the public sphere as a space of communication, which is what Habermas conceived of it, can be conceived online, and to developing the conception of the public sphere for online spaces. And I don't think much work needs to be done there, because I agree with you. I don't think that there are some differences, but still it's a communicative space. In terms of the question about what type of, I think it was, what type of political economy, I'm not quite sure what exactly was being asked, but one thing I wanted to point to is that I think this term surveillance capitalism, which has come out in the last year or two, and that's been increasingly used, all different types of, at the moment, conceptualization of what digital capitalism involves are coming out from different places, whether it be platform capitalism, digital capitalism, surveillance capitalism, and so forth. And they do have different meanings and different origins politically, where platform capitalism came out from a group of people that was much more on the left. Surveillance capitalism comes out from a business studies position where basically capitalism and sort of neoliberal forms of capitalism tend to be okay. And the problem is with the surveillance form of capitalism that Facebook and Google, etc., are performing. That's the problem. My argument with that is the problem is not that Facebook itself is using an advertising model of communication based on targeted advertising and surveillance, because that's not an essential problem. That helps it a lot, but if we were to move to other forms of capitalist-based revenue models, they will still have problems for democracy. For instance, one that's been suggested is contextual advertising, which DuckDuckGo, for instance, uses. And where you don't collect data and target, this goes back to the mass media models of communication, where you basically target based on what is the content of a page, or and you target the readers. But it still incorporates a lot of the problems that Habermas talked about the mass media in terms of reducing the content to the level of the content to try and encourage people to still eyeballs to come to those pages. And the way that it still links back to Habermas's problems with what happened to the colonization of the public sphere in the mass media. The mass media is still, the media still tries to target and bring in eyeballs to consume. So it's still a consumption media rather than it's still a privatizing of the reader. Another, just to mention, a second model is to move away, not simply to use target advertising, is to use subscription models. So there's a lot of newspapers now or mass media are moving to subscription models, and the argument, well, this is a lot better. But it does fall prey to the problem that Facebook itself positions itself against, is that it is it does become an elitist, or at least an exclusionary public sphere where only certain people are reading the Financial Times. So you end up with an elite public sphere, and generally there is still an advertising model, and the content does end up still being targeted, and data is still collected to find out what people are reading. So these profit-oriented models still have problems, and so the rentier model might completely fit of political economy, might completely fit some of these alternative models, which some online organizations are now going back to and claiming now to be much more democratic because they're using these other forms of capitalist profit making. So I think fundamentally, capitalism itself, as Habermas said, capitalist colonization is fundamentally a problem for deliberative democratic public sphere communication. And that's what I want, one of the things I want us to think about being aware of, how that commercialization actually has negative effects on the public sphere. And there was one other question I missed it, but can you please email me, and I will. I'm very happy to exchange discussion online.
Thank you, and Hans. So I'd like to conclude this final session of our conference by thanking our fabulous speakers. I must say that Hans is speaking, and it's after midnight, almost 1 o'clock, if I'm not wrong. Lincoln is in New Zealand, missing lunch with his family on a Saturday morning. So we appreciate the time and consideration that you devoted to the conference and the openness for questions. So thank you so much for the very insightful presentations and for this awesome conclusion of the conference. I also wanted to thank the participants and the audiences of these lives So we had a great week full of discussions and many things to think about, many possibilities of cooperation and collaboration among scholars. So I think we have wonderful 5 days, very intense days. And I would like to thank everybody on behalf of the National Institute of Science and Technology for Digital Democracy in Brazil. I also need to thank CAPES, CNPq, and FAPESB for the funding of the Institute and the conference in itself. And to say that we look forward to the 2021 INCT conference, that it would be wonderful to have our speakers and the participants again, and to continue these conversations over the years. So thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful weekend. Bye.
Thank you, Ricardo.
Thank you. Thank you so much.